that was portrayed as the inner life was also ignored or treated as if it didn't exist. Like if someone had a nervous breakdown or any kind of diagnosis, they talked about and said that someone had problems with their nerves. And as soon as any kind of inner torment, it was always treated pragmatically. Like the men in my family, I remember that anytime anyone was going through anything, any kind of hardship, they would deal with it by renovating a boat or building a porch. And I think that shaped me very much. So when I started working, I brought that kind of perspective into my work life with me, that I thought that everything that had value was tangible and pragmatical and physical. And with that line of reasoning, when I started working, I also assumed that someone who would be a great performer would be someone who had high IQ or lots of university credits or, you know, different kind of credentials. So I started working with some people that were pretty amazing in that sense. But I did realize quickly that some people who have high IQ may still be terrible at pedagogically explaining anything to anyone else but themselves. And I found that people with really high IQ could still be also terrible at teamwork, as I discovered some people who just fell into arguments time and time over again, regardless of this. So, one of the first things that happened to me in my work life is that I was kind of losing my religion. And in losing my religion, I started gaining an interest for what was during my upbringing called the softer sides of life. So I started becoming interested in personality traits, what motivates us, what drives us, and especially, discovering emotions and how that works, being vulnerable, and the power of storytelling and the tremendous energy that there is in culture were two of those softer aspects that really stuck with me, which is what we're going to talk about today. So I've drawn a lot and tried to illustrate as clearly as I can the message that I have and the experiences that I've reached during my work life. So I would like to start with this. I drew this as a map to kind of explain how culture could be thought of as a story, basically, a story that you talk about in any organization. And in this story, it explains things about where you're going and where you're supposed to be. In some organizations, of course, there is no story. There's just a blank paper, and it states the amount of money you will get from working there every month. But when it comes and falls back to the storytelling, I want to share an experience I had with you about this, because I think that culture could be considered as a way of mutually finding the stories that we want to tell our organization. So when I look at the story, the end of it is interesting, because sometimes the end of the story that an organization has, it always just ends with a treasure chest, some kind of, money, basically. But in some organizations, they also have spoken about the higher purpose. So I had the great privilege of working with Dole a couple of years ago, and Dole is a huge organization. So during this, we had a lot of sessions where we spoke about the higher purpose. And one thing that struck me was that when you talk about the higher purpose and you ask 100 people, you get very different responses about how they individually would think about that. Someone would say that, well, I don't know if there's a higher purpose, because basically what we do is that we transport fruits and vegetables from point A to point B. But on the 25th session we had, there was this woman, and she was sitting a little bit in the back. And I recall that I could see her raising her hand and then bringing it down, and then raising her hand and bringing it down, as if she was trying to convince herself to say something. So we did ask her. So we said, what is your take? What is it that you think about when you think about purpose? And then she said with a sense of surprise that, I haven't heard anyone who seems to have the same perspective as I have on our culture. Because what I think about, she said, is that I always think that we're a huge company. Everybody wants to work with us. And a lot of the growers are positioned in countries that are pretty poor, that have lots of problems with infrastructure and so on. And to be one of those growers that works with us, there's some pretty steep demands that they have to be able to solve. We have demands on work safety, on not using pesticides, and lots of regulations, fairness regulations, basically. But she said, what it means is that we have today about 1,000 growers that are connected to us in any shape or form. And in those growers, there is a lot of families connected, of course. And in those families, there are kids. And I think about those kids, she said. I think about how those kids will be sitting there in the afternoon and they get to experience how there is a grown-up who comes home to them. A grown-up who is not coughing their lungs up, which is a common thing in that industry. A grown-up that could put food on the table, which means that they can also help to improve the part of the world where they live, one generation at a time. And while we do this, I also like the fact, she said, that what we are producing is something that cannot be overly consumed, because it's good for the individual, it's good for the planet, it's good for everyone. So basically, she just gave us a scoop, because that is what happens when you ask a lot of people the same questions. And it was quiet for a long time after she left that statement. It was very, down to earth, very simple, just straight from the heart. It didn't sound like a sales pitch or anything like that at all. And this is what happens from time to time when we think about culture this way, as part of that story, and we help people be part of telling that story. So I'm going to describe some of that to you today about how that process works. So what else I can say? Well, I've been in these kind of topics for a long time. I think that the common thing about my books is that I write about things that are like in parameters in an organization, something that will affect an organization. For example, the kind of personality traits that you put in there, the kind of generations that you put in there, the kind of national cultures that you mix, and so on. So I've come to realize that this has always been the core of what I'm interested in, what I feel passionately engaged about. And the books they have come to be because of field work, because I've had the pleasure of working with company culture for a long time and had the chance to try that process out, because it really is a process, trying to figure out, okay, how do you create it? What is the pitfalls? What is the pros? What is the cons? What is the thing to avoid? And one thing that strikes me, because today I have my own company, we call ourselves Värdeverket, or the Value Agency, where basically we think of culture and the process of culture as an engine. It's an engine for change, it is an engine for clarity, and it is also an engine for engagement. And it's a tool to make sure that the strategies are empowered. That's basically what we think that culture is. So it strikes me, going through the range of different organizations that we worked with, because we've been everything from homicide detectives to old construction companies to newly started tech companies. What you realize very quickly is that every industry has its own power laws of nature. Like, for example, if you are a consultancy firm, I would bet my money that you have the same challenge when it comes to your organization that most other consultancy houses have, because it's a part of that industry. And that challenge would perhaps be that you have this longing to create a sense of togetherness, but with a group of employees who will spend the greater part of their time at another employee's physical offices. And so what happens from time to time, though, working with all these power laws, because I find them really interesting, is that from time to time you will stumble across one of those consultancy firms that doesn't have that problem at all, that has managed to create a strong sense of togetherness with people that maybe only meet 20% of the time. And when you try to zoom in and think about, so why is that? Why are they outside of this? The answer is 9 cases out of 10. The answer relates back to culture. And so what I want to try to do today is also connect this part of thinking about how data is a very relevant and a very strong and structured tool in developing culture. It might seem counterintuitive sometimes to think that something digital will make something more human-like. But I would like to argue that that is the case. So the first thing I would like to stress, and I think if there's only one thing I can ever tell anyone about culture that needs to hear it, I would say that there's only one slide that I would like for you to remember, unless you've already carrying this thought. And this is that the one harsh truth about culture is that people will only care if they've had the chance to affect whatever culture you're creating. So that old way of doing it, when there was a CEO who had some kind of an epiphany by itself, those kind of cultures are pretty much always stillborn because there is no engagement from anyone else. You can always passively like what someone else is telling you that the culture is, but as soon that that it gets uncomfortable or turbulent, you will always back away and kind of shy yourself from responsibility by telling yourself that, well, I wasn't really responsible for this culture. Someone told me what it was. I didn't take in creating it. So co-creation, participation, democratic collective organizations, that is the only way to actually create a culture that is not just that caricature that we all experience too. Because I think a lot of us have experienced those companies where you just put a damn word on the wall and it doesn't mean crap. And that's because of the process. That's the whole difference. It's kind of like when someone gives you flowers. It could mean nothing if it's a stranger, but it could also mean everything if it is someone you care about. I think when we talk about values, it's the same way in a company. So with that said, if we think about it as a story, then I could perhaps inspire you to think about some of those perspectives of that story. Because a lot of the times when people say, yes, we have culture, and then they talk about three words, and there's the three core values. And yeah, three core values may be part of a culture, but it's the way I look at it is just a fragment of it. So one way to look at it is to ask questions to your own organization. Looking at the map, one question that might be relevant might be, who are the heroes? But when you ask your organization, who are the heroes? The answer could be flattering or it could be embarrassing. But the courage to ask is everything. Because it might be that people would say in your organization that, well, the heroes here, it seems like it's the sales department because they get the credit for everything. But it might also be something flattering where people would say that, I think that we all feel like we are alike. We're all the heroes in this story. And then there's all these other aspects you can bring out. You can talk about the higher purpose. You can talk about what makes us unique. Because a good part of what brings pride to a person is also to know that whatever you're doing is not just a carbon copy of what everyone else is doing. You are unique in some sense of the word. And the blueprint is one of the more interesting and fascinating aspects of culture. I'm not going to talk about that for a long time now, but I'm going to try to condense it into saying this. The blueprint could be described as if you ask everyone in your organization and you say, what if everything needs to change because of the world is changing? What is the last thing that you would like for us to change? What do you think is the most core aspect of what we are? What would be so taboo that if we change this, you might even think about working somewhere else? And then the other aspects could be the core values, think about what they are, and more importantly, what behaviors that would signify that we are living those core values. Behaviors tend to be the key. And behaviors in itself is also an area you could expand and talk about and theorize about for a long time. But think of it like this. A behavior is something that you will be able to observe. So cooperation is an attitude, but the way I cooperate might be things you could observe me doing. Maybe I'm cooperating by acknowledging something you said by nodding or writing it down. So that's a big part of it. But one that I think holds a lot of strength is something that was described at one time by JFK when he defended all the resources that were poured into the NASA space program by saying, we go to the moon not because it's easy, but because it's hard. And what that means is that I find that culture that is strong always has a dragon. They have some kind of thing that they need to tame or slay. And it could be different things in different organizations. I don't know what that would signify to you, To be able to tell someone who is an applicant to say that this is the dragon we are out to slay is a very powerful statement and a very strong thing to put into your organization. And then outside of that, there are all types of things that you can use to plot up a story. And these are just examples. Quite frankly, we have like a ton of different questions that we use, and we try to use it based on the needs of the organization. So some of these questions might be more or less relevant. But if you think about it as a story, it's easier to capture what it actually is. Because if you start thinking about what culture is, if you start from the very edges of it, you could say that, well, a word like fika, that is culture. Or if you are from the mid-western parts of Africa, a word like Ubuntu would be culture. Because both of those words that I described, they're kind of like containers that you can open up and there's a whole story behind them. And I love the story about Ubuntu because it's a phrase that you use to greet someone. But when I say Ubuntu, what it means is that I'm greeting you by telling you that I exist because you exist and we are part of the same system. So all of these stories are amazingly, in that sense, amazing that they portray a narrative on how we tend to look at life. And like I said, these are the outer rims of what culture could be, depending on the national culture you're born with, maybe also the generational culture that you might have, being born and bred in a certain time and certain fabrics, certain zeitgeist, as the Germans would call it, that would stick to you and make you preserve certain attitudes that has to do with the time that formed you. And then there's always also an industry culture as well, where you might experience that people that's been in the industry for a long time might have different viewpoints than people that are newer in that industry. So to really understand culture, you need to think in a very wide manner. But in order to understand the culture that we're talking about today, which is called the microculture, it's a bit more narrower, because then we can think of the kind of culture that exists in an organization works on a very simple scheme. It basically means that as soon as three people enter a room, culture starts to form. We start to observe each other, we start to ping pong, mimic, and mirror each other's behavior, which means that what we do in the beginning has a tendency to set a strong tone for what's going to happen afterwards. So let's say I'm the first person in a room with two people I've never met before. If I hold the door for them, I'm probably going to make them mimic and mirror that behavior, and they're going to try to do something courteous and nice back to me, because that's, in a nutshell, how simple humans are. And that also evokes a question, because if it's simple, because what happens is that those behaviors are bouncing back and forth, they become the norm. As person number 4, 5, and 6 are also added, they will start observing what I'm doing. They will probably fall into that character too. And over time, we will talk about that these are the norms that we have here. And we will even start calling it our culture. So the one thing to consider, though, is why it sometimes goes wrong. And there have been these studies where they used embedded actors that try dysfunctional behaviors. For example, they tried what happens if you put someone who is, locked on their phone in a situation where other people are having, engaged conversation. And based on that, they could see that if you do this, if you enter that with your, locked on your phone, it's probably just going to be a couple of minutes until you're going to inspire someone else to also pick up their phone and kind of tap out of the meeting. So in essence, it could be said that in general, bad behaviors are more contagious than good behaviors. Sometimes they would even say that it's like a 5-to-1 ratio on it. So that's one thing to keep a watch for, because culture can both exist, regardless if we do anything about it, or we can also mold it by applying a process where we actively ask questions and we democratically find the answers to these questions. And that's the kind of culture we want. The kind of culture that can be shaped and molded to be sustainable, strong, energetic engagement, and also that brings empowerment to whatever we need in order to exist and thrive as an organization. So, of course, one way to define it is to just say that, well, this is what culture is. It's a mental collective contract. It's something that, over time will give me clarity on how we do things. Also worth noticing, though, is that culture is complex. It's not complicated. Complicated things is predictable, even if it might involve millions of parts. Culture is complex in the sense that whatever individual you bring into your culture, into your organization, will be affected by that culture. But every individual will also affect that culture. So it means that culture is unpredictable, but we can, give it direction. We can make it a bit more predictable by writing things down, creating ideas about what we think are the good, the right ethics, the right morals, the right values. What I like to do, because I like that how that metaphor works, is to think of culture as an operating system. Because in an operating system, you have certain things you have. For example, error handling. And you have error handling in an organization as well. Because if you think about it, what happens if you fail miserably in an organization? Well, in some organizations, the error handling means that you are marked, that someone pegs that on you, and then there might be a blame culture going on. In other cultures, you might have an error handling where it's more of an instinct that everyone just forms a union and they say, something broke, let's fix it together. So there's all these different aspects that where the culture in a given organization teaches us things about how hierarchy works, how vulnerability works. Can I be myself at work, or am I supposed to have this formal professional shell outside of myself? Can I tell people about what's going on, or will I have to make excuses? There's all these different things that over time become what culture is. So working with culture is a way to kind of fast track and speed that up. So, in line with the same metaphor, I would also like to think that it's a good idea to treat culture like software, to think of it as something that you will use and you will update it from time to time without that being an error. So you might have a culture that's a version 1.1, but then you can at any time create a version 1.1, a 1.2, because there's a need, there's something that happens that makes that relevant. And I think it's a good idea to get your organization to be used to that line of thinking of the culture as an organic movement, something that is happening. So basically in any organization, as Gallup discovered, there's three types of resources. There are the co-workers, there are the actively unengaged, and there are people that are highly engaged. And people that are engaged, we want to make sure that that group grows. And one way to make them grow is to give them the tools, the means, and the possibility to participate in shaping whatever reason, whatever direction you want to have for your culture and your organization. And this is where data and stories comes in. So I'm going to share a story about something that happened. We were working with this organization. It's been around for 100 years. In this organization, they had this statement that was formed by their founder 100 years ago. He said, I want this to be just like home. And over time, this became lots of different interpretations of what that was supposed to mean. Some people felt that, just like home means that I should be able to bring my kids to work. And even if it's a construction site, it should be so safe that they could be there, they could walk around there, and that would be safe enough. And someone else said that no, just like home means that we should have this tone, this way of speaking to each other that will be just as informal as we would speak to our own family in our own living room. And someone else said that, well, no, maybe it should mean that we build things with the kind of quality and the attention to detail that we would use if we were building it for ourselves. So when we stepped in, there were 700 people working in that organization. So we gave them pen and paper and told them to sit down and kind of get to an idea about what that meant. And what they did is that they created 63 A4 pages of text about what that meant. So it became basically a book. And one of the powers of what you can do nowadays that is so incredible is that you can use AI. You can tell AI in the very moment, in real time, in that room, and say, okay, so take all these texts, condense it. Tell me in 800 characters, what is actually the three base characteristics that they are talking about when they say just like home. And to be able to do this have really shifted the way it is to work with organizations and the way it is to work with culture. Because to me, it feels nowadays like I am a journalist and I'm basically just taking the memoirs of every organization going forward and helping them to, step by step, put clarity in things that probably been a bit abstract for years. This is the real power of AI, how you can use it. And one thing also to consider is that a smart way is to give the preliminary answers, which is basically AI, right away. But there's always a smarter, more reflective, analytical side that only a human brain can bring out afterwards. Because still, at sometimes, I would like to say that AI sometimes tend to be retarded. You know, it can do certain things really, really smart, but there's always that last thing. Or I shouldn't use the word always. Right now, the human brain still has the advantage. When you have those two steps, you could create something very strongly where you could actually tell people truthfully that this is the voice, this is your voice, and retell what they're thinking about things. Another thing to consider about, because as with anything as you work, without data, you're just a person with an opinion. You want to use data as much as possible to your advantage. So we always use these questions, for example, to kind of put some tabs on where any given organization is. Because the interesting part is that you can use this culture index, you could put it in a database, and then you can store it, you can look at different disciplines. And what's always interesting about measuring is not the actual number, it is the trend. You want to make sure with your own organization, regardless of what questions you would use to kind of assess your culture, that it's trending the right way, that you're doing the right things. And just as a summary, I would also like to just show you something for inspiration. We believe in something called culture contracts, which is a way to visually use a metaphor for each organization. We try to find something symbolically that describes what they are. And through these visualizations, you have a way to create kind of one pagers that describe what their culture is supposed to be like. So we did this example, we did this for a construction company. Then we used something that looks like the floor plan out of a house, but with every room you can push different aspects and see, okay, so what is the mutual answer, the mutual story that we came up with when it came to this? Because in the end of the days, quality is the absence of variation. And you relieve that variation by making sure that people have been communicated and been part of the same process, that they've heard the same things. So I would like to summarize and just say that there are certain steps that usually used to be able to drive this whole process from start to finish, where you ask the room in real time, you take their memoirs, you use AI to in real time tell them what their story is, make sure that everyone agrees to what the story is, and usually they do because it's their own words just reshaped. And then by doing that, you create that kind of engagement and commitment that gives energy to culture, the real culture. Because there are lots of things you can spend your time on in any organization, but it's hard to come up with anything that is more cost efficient than the kind of organizations and discussions you might have on culture. And my last word is this. If you want more inspiration, look at our homepage. There is this booklet you can download for free, which is basically a PDF with some neat little tricks about how to enforce your culture. So with that said, do we have any questions? Well, yeah, we don't have a lot of time for questions, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to hang out in the chat and mingle area afterwards, and then we can do more questions if you want to. I'm not in a hurry to go. Oh, thank you, Nina. So, how to create a healthy culture if statistically 80% of managerial positions are occupied by narcissists, sociopaths, or psychopaths? Well, first of all, is that statistically so, though? Because I think we use those terms a lot. And of course, there are certain kind of toxic environments that might attract that kind of person. But I would say no, it's not possible. You will, of course, have a strong culture, but it might be a strong and freaking horrible culture. So that it's strong just basically means that everyone has the same idea of what it is. Strong and sustainable is something else. And in order to have something that's strong and sustainable, there needs to be both care and candor. There's like two axes that you need to be able to deliver upon. Okay, yes, of course. This is the link. So it's värdeverket.org. And then there's just one tab called inspiration, and there's a bunch of stuff over there that relates to culture. What inspired this, as you might see, is the old folder that everyone got in Sweden called Om kriget kommer, because that one was terrifying to get. So we figured let's try to make something more positive about the same thing. Thank you very much. So I'll switch to the mingle area in case someone wants to talk. Hey, Katarina. Thank you.